Before we're getting to the next section, I want to do a short intermission. And this one is strings, lists, and tuples, because those are surprisingly similar. All three of them are basically just containers. They just happen to have different formats. And as a consequence, you can move between them very easily and also use indexing on strings. Let me demonstrate all of this actually. I already have two variables, a test string and a test list. I suppose we can start by turning a string into a list or a tuple. The two are very similar. We don't really have to worry about the difference here. And to convert a string to a list or tuple, you have a couple of different ways. The first one, we can use the test string and then use the method split. And this one splits the string at a certain point. If you don't specify anything in here and print the result, we are using a space to separate the values. If you enter a value in here, let's say a t, and run this again, we now separate this wherever we have a t. We start at the beginning here, and the t in there disappears, meaning now in the string, this t disappears, and we have an empty string at the beginning of the list. Then we have all of this stuff here up to the next t, which is his is a and then a space. Then we have the next t here, and this one then gets us to the next point, the es bit, this one here. And then finally we have another t, and this one disappears, and we are just left with an empty string. Most of the time you are just going to use this space here. This one does make a whole lot more sense. Another thing you could do is to use the list function. And this one turns any kind of data type into some kind of list, or at least it tries to. It doesn't work with every data type, but a string definitely does work. If I run this, we are now turning every single character into one element inside of a list. This would also work with a tuple. This is another function. Here we can add a test string once again. And now we have the same thing, except now it's a tuple instead of a list. The other way also works just fine. We can turn a list or a tuple into a string. Although the process here can be a bit weird. Basically, what you would be doing is you first get a string. And right now I'm going to leave it empty intentionally. Then I need a dot, and then I need a specific method. And this method is called join. And into this method as an argument, I have to pass in some kind of list. And as an argument here, we are going to need a list or a tuple. Although it has to be a special kind of tuple, because this one has to contain some kind of string. Let's say 1 and 2, just to keep it simple. And now if I run this, these two elements here have been merged together. What we are specifying inside of the string is going to be what determines the gap between the two. Right now it's empty, so there's no gap between 1 and 2. I guess I could just add the gap in here. If I run this now, we get 1 gap 2. If we added more values in here, let's say 3 and 4, we would always have a gap between each of these values. Most of the time, you are just going to leave it empty, and now you have one space between the values. What you really have to be careful here, though, is that all of these values have to be a string. I guess let me copy it and replace this with the test list we have up here. If I run this now, we are getting an error that Python has a type error, sequence item 0, expected a string instance int found, which is Python's way of saying it wanted a word or a string, but it found a number, and it's really not happy about it. Finally, what you can do is to, let me print it again, you can use the str function and pass in a list in here to turn this list into a string. If I run this now, we are getting what looks like a list, but this is actually a word or a string. To demonstrate this, let me put all of this inside of the type function. If I run this now, we get class string. This one here is going to be a string. It just looks like a list. But I hope you get the idea. One more thing really quick, and that is indexing on strings. This one works like it would work for a list. For example, I could have my test string, and then here I want the first element, which right now should be a t. If I print all of this, I am indeed getting a t. Just like with a list, in the string, the first element is going to be a 0, then we have 1, 2, 3, and so on. You could even use slicing here and, for example, add a 5, and now we're getting this, the first word. And I think it is quite valuable here to compare these two data types, because when you think about words, they really are just containers for individual characters. And for Python, it made a lot of sense to make these interchangeable with a list or a tuple because, well, it does make kind of sense. One of the major operations you are going to do as a programmer is to work between different data types. So understanding how you can change one data type to another data type is a really valuable experience. But okay, there's one exercise I do want you guys to do, and that is going to be connected to this operation here. Let me copy it and add an exercise here at the end. What I want you guys to do on this string test list, I want you guys to use string methods to remove all of the stuff so you only get 1, 2, 3, and 4. Let me comment out all of the other parts to see what we get. Right now, we're getting square brackets, then 1, 2, 3, 4, and square brackets again. And I only want to have 1, 2, 3, and 4. Try to use some methods to get rid of all of the other values besides the numbers and see how far you get. To make this a bit easier, let me save the result in a separate variable. Let's call it exercise. This is also what I want to print. Right now, we have to get rid of a couple of different things. Let's start with the square brackets. For those, we need the method we have already seen much earlier called strip. And this one, we want to start with one of the square brackets. Doesn't really matter which one you start with. If I run this now, we get rid of one square bracket. And remember, we can combine different methods, meaning I can call strip again, and now add the other square brackets, the closing one. We now have all the numbers and the commas in between them. And to get rid of the commas, we want to replace them, meaning I want to target my comma and then replace it with an empty string, so nothing. Now if I run this, we are only getting the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4, and we are done. If you wanted to, you could even get rid of the spaces here as well. And this you would achieve with another replace method. And now I want to target the empty space and replace this with nothing. Now if I run this, we have all of the numbers right next to each other, whichever you prefer. At this point, this is hopefully at least manageable.